Hello, everybody. Thanks for tuning in for another one of our lunchtime live stream lectures. My name is Maria Coleman, and I'm the Director of Development at the Seward House Museum. I'm joined today by Jeff Ludwig, our Director of Education, and our special guest, Walter Stahr, who's the author of Seward, Lincoln's Indispensable Man.
Thanks, Maria. I think we were going to try to give people a few more minutes to arrive and find this. So before we get into our interview proper and speaking about Walter's current research and his Seward book, Walter, could you tell us about maybe the first time you've come to Auburn? I know you've done 2 different book talks. When was the first time you actually saw the Seward House?
I first saw it before I really decided to do the Seward book. I was kind of thinking about it. And I had a day or two and I said, well, I've never seen this place. I was living at the time in the DC area. So I got in my car and drove forever to get up at upstate New York. And the staff there was so enthusiastic about Seward, about Francis, about Fanny, about the dogs, that by the time I left, I was pretty sure that I was going to write a Seward book.
For everyone just tuning in, we're with Walter Stahr, a biographer of, among other volumes, Seward, Lincoln's Indispensable Man, which is always for sale in our gift shop, and I think you can also buy it online. We hope you buy your copy from us, but make sure you buy your copy. When we were promoting the event, we described in the blurb this has become basically a required reading for anybody new coming on to the Seward House staff. So it's a good thing we have so many copies. And I remember spending my first few weeks on the job with this book, taking it home, and realizing just how much depth there was to Seward, because this is a bit of a doorstopper. And everyone, we're like 600 pages, 600 and almost 700 pages when you include all the notes, but a really good book, and not a book that you get stuck on. It flows easily, and we sell a lot of copies. A lot of visitors leave with this, so we always keep it in stock. We're glad to have Walter as a friend of the museum. When I was first hired, within my 2nd or 3rd day, I don't know if you remember this, Walter. You sent me an email welcoming me to the Seward team. And everyone who's come after me has sort of spent their time as they orient themselves with this book. So we're really glad to be able to have Walter here. Maria, do you think we should begin interviewing him properly? And we want to make sure everyone at home who's tuning in now, if you've read the book, if you haven't read the book, if you're planning on ordering the book or all of Walter's books, we want your input. We want this to be interactive. I've got about a dozen questions that I'd like not to ask Walter today. We want you to ask him questions. So please don't be shy as you're logging in. Tell us where you're watching from. And throughout, don't feel like you have to wait till the end. Throughout this, Walter would prefer to talk to you than to us. Maria will be monitoring questions and comments, and she would love to put them to Walter. Anything you want to know, now's our chance. We have until about 1 o'clock today, our time. He's in California, so he got up extra early on the West Coast in Pacific time. So he's having his morning coffee. We're having lunch, and we have him for about an hour.
Right, so I'm just going to start off with a couple opener questions for Walter. So first, how did you first become interested in William Seward, and how did you decide to turn that interest into writing a biography of him?
Well, I think like lots of people, I met William Seward through Doris Kearns Goodwin's great book, Team of Rivals. I probably had touched on him in American history way back when, but I didn't know anything about him really until I read that book. And I had written one biography. I was kind of thinking about what I might do next. And I took to my agent kind of 4 one-page versions of 4 different books. And he read one after another. And when he got to Seward, it was like a eureka moment. He said, this is it. This is the book you're going to write.
And what was the most surprising or maybe the most interesting thing that you learned about Seward while you were doing your research?
Oh gosh, there were so many. One that comes immediately to mind, a lot of folks think of Seward as sort of always in the business of acquiring more land. But when I looked at him in his Senate years in the 1850s, I found a number of times when he was opposed to acquiring more land for the United States. It really, his his acquisitive phase kind of started in the Civil War. He couldn't do much during the Civil War, but then after the Civil War, then he gets going.
And how do you feel that Seward's legacy has endured even into the present day? How is he still relevant today?
Well, I think it's especially relevant today as we have, George Floyd protests and Black Lives Matter, to talk about the folks who, at some considerable personal cost, spoke up for Black lives in the 1840s and 1850s. Right there in Auburn, Seward made himself very unpopular by defending the accused murderer, William Freeman, a Black man who unquestionably had killed 4 white people, but whose defense was insanity and whom there was much reason to believe was insane. But that's one obvious relevance today. Seward was a man who spoke up for Black rights when doing so was unpopular.
Maria, are there any questions in so far?
So I have one question that was sent to us ahead of time by John Yurka, one of our volunteers. And so his question is, Frances died in Washington in 1865. Her funeral was held at St. Peter's Church in Auburn. Then a little more than a year later, in 1866, Fanny died in Washington, and her funeral was held at St. John's Church in Lafayette Square. Seward had been an active member of St. John's Church since moving to Washington. And when Frances died, most of the family was in or near Washington, with the exception of Lizette, Janet, and her children, yet Frances's funeral was in Auburn. Then in 1866, when Fanny died, there were fewer family members near Washington. So do you have any insight into why these funerals were held where they were instead of both of them being in Washington or both being in Auburn?
Yeah, I'm frantically looking at the book. I seem to remember that Seward said at his wife's funeral in Auburn that she had asked him as she was dying in Washington to take her back to Auburn and to allow her to be in the garden for a few hours before the funeral. And whether she used those precise words or not, she was always so much more attached to the house than he was. I mean, yes, he lived there for a long time, but for her, this was where she grew up, and so I'm pretty sure that the reason her funeral was in Auburn was that she was very clear with her husband that that's where she wanted it. And Fanny, I don't think, had such a strong attachment. And as the questioner pointed out, by that point, Seward was, in a sense, in some respects, more of a Washington person than an Auburn person.
And another, go ahead, Jeff.
If we have visitor audience questions, let them come out, let them fly.
All right, so another question we have that came in on Facebook. Can you please discuss Seward's interactions with other cabinet members? Did they all get along?
Did they all get along? No, I think it'd be easier to sort of name those who did get along than those who didn't. So Seward, Seward had a tendency to sort of assume that he was in charge, much more so than was true today. To be Secretary of State was to be first in the cabinet, and he was Secretary of State, so he thought of himself as first. And so, people like Gideon Welles, the Secretary of the Navy, we know a lot about what he thought because he every night wrote in his diary. He really did not like Seward. He thought that Seward was forever sort of taking charge, or my current subject, Salmon Chase, who also kept a fairly detailed diary. He and Seward had a somewhat, complicated, long relationship, but I can't say that they really got along. They were more friendly than people have thought, but so no, they did not all get along. Is the short answer to that.
Jumping off that cabinet member question, Walter, so it occurs to me now that you're working on your new biography on Salmon Chase, and last you were in Auburn in 2017. It was your book tour for the Edwin Stanton biography you'd written, and then you started your entree, it seems, into the team of rivals cabinet was with Seward, and I'm glad your publisher steered you that way, and the Seward House convinced you it was the right decision to spend years of your life with him. My first sort of easy softball question is, are you going to continue down this path and sort of collect rivals? And if so, who's next?
I think when I finish with Salmon Chase that I'm done with Lincoln and his cabinet. I think I'm going to shift to a different time period and leave the Civil War. Having said that, I sort of felt the same way when I was working on Edwin Stanton, and I floated a variety of possibilities with my editor, but none of them caught her attention the way Chase did. And so conceivably, I'm just fated to continue marching down my current path and remain in the Civil War. And there are some advantages in that, I know the period pretty well, I know the sources, and I know people who are, Civil War folks. No definite next is out there. So if folks have strong views, they can contact me on my webpage, and I will. I've already been pitched, Stephen Douglas really needs a new biography. And someone recently said, Montgomery Blair, underappreciated, need to do it.
And we'll put your website up at the end so you can see it. And Walter's got a great blog that I follow, and you can learn about where he is in his research and sort of what's going on. I enjoy checking in pretty regularly. So clearly, I think now on your third Civil War era Lincoln cabinet figure, you're reaching the point where you're able to layer in so much pre-existing knowledge to your chase because you've spent so much time observing and studying history through the point of view of Seward and the lens of Stanton. Seward was first, and the book's almost a decade old now. It came out in 2012. I imagine you probably were done a lot of the writing 2010, 2011. If you were to go back and visit today and revisit it or revise, has your perception of Seward changed? Would you make any major interpretive changes? Are there areas you'd like to explore if you could go in now, knowing all that you know from a decade in the period?
Well, there's certainly, some mistakes. One that comes to mind, in talking about the election of 1860, I talked about how Seward's incredible campaign for Lincoln, and I said that others who had been candidates gave, like Chase, gave one or two token speeches. Well, now that I've gone through the 1860 campaign with Chase, I realized that he did a lot more than give a few token speeches. Not as much as Seward, but still he was an important factor in that campaign. So there's some minor things that I would change, but no, I don't think I would, my basic sort of ideas about Seward probably would remain the same. I probably would devote a bit more time, just given where we are as a nation, to Seward's relations with individual Black people and his work for Black defendants as a lawyer and his advocacy for Black rights as a senator and in the cabinet.
Maria, feel free to cut me off if questions come in. You got
I
one?
was just about to do so. So another question we had come in via Facebook from Leighton Carr. Why do you think Seward supported Andrew Johnson?
That is one of the deep mysteries of William Henry Seward, because you have this man who, before the war, is famous or infamous in the South for his support for Black rights and his opposition to the extension of slavery. And then when Andrew Johnson becomes president, in a sense, the first few months are easy to answer because pretty much everyone supported Andrew Johnson when he first became president. I mean, it's tragic, the first president to be not merely to die in office, but to be killed in office. And Andrew Johnson, this not very educated tailor from North Carolina, takes over, and everyone sympathizes with him. But then when Johnson becomes the enemy of Black rights and Black voting, why is it that Seward sides with him rather than siding with his Republican friends like Senator Charles Sumner or Chief Justice Chase? I think a lot of it comes back to the question a couple of questions ago, to the death of his wife, Frances. She was, in a sense, his moral compass. And when she's gone, he's just not as attuned to the plight of Black Americans as he was when she was alive.
And then another question that just came in from Roberta Kohut on Facebook, which goes back to an earlier question a little bit. If the cabinet members did not all get along with one another personally, how did these interactions affect Lincoln's decisions?
Oof. Lincoln, and this was a point that annoyed some of them, he didn't, prior presidents had had a system which might be called kind of cabinet government, where they gathered the cabinet together and they discussed the issue, and whatever the cabinet wanted, that was what happened. Lincoln didn't believe in that. He believed he was the president. And he basically said to each cabinet member, look, you run your department. Seward, you're in charge of foreign affairs. I'm not going to interfere much. Chase, you're in charge of raising the money. I don't have much. And so the disagreements and even quarrels among the cabinet members really didn't affect Lincoln that much. He was able to get on with what he focused on, which was mainly the military side, without worrying too much about, Seward and Wells disagreeing about some issue of sort of where naval and foreign policy intersected.
Well, maybe before we go too far down the Seward rabbit hole, I know Chase has been foremost on your mind of late, and in a recent blog post, you updated your followers that you were in the year 1863. Is that still accurate in your manuscript?
Oh no, I am now in late 1867.
Oh wow!
Yeah, so so Salmon Chase is now Chief Justice of the United States. And he is about, in 1868, he's about to sort of have kind of two major events, one being our first impeachment of a president. And when the president is impeached and tried in the Senate, the Chief Justice presides. So he presides over the impeachment trial of Johnson in the spring of '68. And then as that is winding down, suddenly newspapers in New York are all talking about the Chief Justice as the possible Democratic presidential candidate, which is, again, kind of dramatic reversal. He'd been not merely a member of the Republican Party, but kind of a founding father of the Republican Party. So for him to switch in this way was quite dramatic. And so that year, 1868, is going to take me a little while. And then I'm hoping that the remainder of his life will form one further chapter. So I'm fairly close to the end of his life in 1873.
For those of us less familiar with Chase than we should be, could you give us a brief biographical sketch of who he was leading up to where you've just taken us? A man who, like Seward, believed himself a fine candidate to be president in 1860, and with a history almost as deeply entwined as Seward's in the debates of the 1840s, 50s, 60s, and so on?
Sure. So he's roughly a contemporary of Seward. And he's born in New Hampshire, spends a bit of time as a boy in Ohio under the care of his uncle, the first Episcopal Bishop of Ohio. Attends Dartmouth College and graduates Phi Beta Kappa. Spends some time in Washington where he reads law and then returns to Ohio. Ohio is really kind of his home base. In the late 1830s, early 1840s, like Seward, he's a Whig, and he becomes a member of the city council in Cincinnati. But then, unlike Seward, who remains a Whig right through the full life of the Whig Party, Chase gets disgusted with the approach of both the Whigs and the Democrats to the slavery issue and leaves the Whig Party and becomes a member of first the Liberty Party and then the Free Soil Party and then the Republican Party. He's really kind of a founding father of both Free Soil and Republican parties. His career intersects with that of Seward at a number of points, perhaps most notably in the debate on the Compromise of 1850, when Chase's big moment in the sun, his big speech on slavery, is sort of eclipsed by Seward's famous higher law speech. And Chase, that really grates on him. He agrees with what Seward's saying, but to have all the attention taken annoys him. His resume is in many respects similar to Seward. He serves as a governor of Ohio and as a senator, and then, like Seward, becomes a member of Lincoln's cabinet on day one. Seward gets the #1 spot as Secretary of State. Chase gets the #2 spot as Secretary of the Treasury. Unlike Seward, he doesn't remain in the cabinet all the way through into Lincoln's second term. He resigns in the summer of '64 and is kind of out of office briefly, and then in late '64, Lincoln names him as Chief Justice of the United States.
Well, you were kind enough to share an advanced copy of some of your manuscript with Maria and I a few weeks ago when you agreed to join us for today's live stream interview. And in it, you write interestingly, so we can unpack maybe specifically Seward and Chase some more. You write that while their respective political friends, their Thurlow Weeds, their associates, busied themselves in the Lincoln years attacking the other man, so Seward surrogates attacking Chase and vice versa, that these two men were, in your words, not enemies. Could you give us basically the Seward-Chase breakdown and what it was like when these two men were in a room together?
Well, you might say, just looking at their resumes, oh, they must have, been very similar, as I mentioned, senators, governors, political types, lawyers, but indeed, even some of the other sort of stuff. I mean, they were both members of the Episcopal Church, and yet they were so different because Chase had this kind of steel backbone that never bent. Whereas William Henry Seward, you got him in a room with a sort of social setting with cigars and brandy, and my goodness, the fireworks. So, you know, Chase, though, found when he was with Seward that he liked him better than he thought he would. There was one, after an evening at Seward's house, Chase wrote to his daughter Kate that Seward, quote, always impresses me very favorably, and not at all as the artful man he is reputed to be. He's certainly able. He certainly sometimes does things he ought not to do, but he does talk and act very much like a man desiring above all things to serve his country. So you can see there, he's a little surprised at how much he likes Seward. You know, he in some sense, I mean, he reads the papers too. He knows that his surrogates, as you said, Jeff, are attacking Seward, but when he's in the room with him, he likes him.
Thank you. So my general perception coming into talking to you, and I can't wait to read the book, was that when we think about where Seward and Chase fit ideologically on the spectrum of not just party, but political beliefs and values, is that Seward is a little bit shifty. He's as you've said, not the steel backboned guy. He's a pragmatist, and he sometimes seeks compromise and makes concessions and negotiates. Chase more the radical. Is that fair? And then that's my perception, at least as it revolves around the issue of slavery. Where does Chase stand on other issues at the time that we know where we can place Seward on debates over immigration, women's rights, race in general? Is Chase consistently, we might say, to Seward's left on this? Is he more progressive across the board? Are there areas where Seward is maybe a more radical politician and ideologue than Chase is?
Well, on immigration, I'd say that they're pretty similar. Before there's this party in the 1850s called the Know Nothings, the sort of anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic party, and they are both opposed to that. Seward has some very strong connections with Catholic friends. Chase doesn't have that so much, but boy, he gives some very strong speeches against immigration restrictions. He doesn't have a veto as the governor of Ohio, but he kind of exercises an influence over legislatures to prevent some anti-immigrant measures from becoming law in Ohio. And on women's rights, I just found a quote that for some reason has never made its way into biographies of Chase. In late 1867, the papers reported that Chase was in favor of women's voting. The issue was on the ballot that year in Kansas, and Chase said that if he was a voter in Kansas, he would vote in favor of it. He thought it would be good for elections, good for those who were elected, and good for women themselves. And this quote not only appears sort of in papers, lots of papers in 1867, but it gets reprinted into the 1890s and the early 1900s as, you know, as women are still trying to get the right to vote. So it's going to make it into my biography. So I think by the end of their lives, Chase was probably a little bit more firmly in favor of women's rights than Seward.
Another part of the manuscript you shared with us is Chase's point of view leading up to the 1860 Republican convention in Chicago that Lincoln wins, obviously, on the third ballot. And I was a little less surprised to read in your narrative that Chase expected Seward to win. It seemed likely to many, but that he admitted that he might actually rejoice in a Seward victory. So at the risk of playing a counterfactual historian, sometimes in my own head I imagine what a Seward presidency would have looked like, and so many variables, but you knowing more of the players and the moving pieces, can you imagine a scenario in which Seward does what Lincoln does and it brings many of his rivals into coalition govern with him. And do you think there would have been a place for a Chase from Ohio in a President Seward's cabinet?
Oh yeah, the cabinets in those days were very much formed by less with a focus on particular people and more with a focus on geography and factions within a party. And so Chase, as you know, representing Ohio, which is at the time the third most populous state, and representing kind of, if you will, the radical wing of the party, I'm almost sure that President Seward would have brought Chase into the cabinet. He might well have brought Abraham Lincoln into the cabinet as representing what was at the time the far West. You know, I mean, Illinois was, you know, almost as far as you could go. You know, so I think President Seward would likely, the cabinet of President Seward would not have looked that different than the cabinet of President Lincoln. It would have, I think Seward would have attempted what Lincoln attempted in the secession winter, to try to find some Southerners, or if he couldn't get true Southerners, to find some border state men to emphasize that the Republican Party was not, one of the insults that was thrown at the Republican Party in 1860 was that it was a sectional party, that it was, you know, only a northern party. And in a sense, it's true. I mean, there were 0 votes for Abraham Lincoln in places like Mississippi because no one would dare to print the ballots. But there were some individual Southerners who were Republicans, and I think President Seward would have tried to persuade some of those people to join his cabinet.
And another question from Facebook, Walter. Some historians have painted Chase as a tremendous egoist. Is that a bad rap? What was Seward's ego like? He was, after all, a man of great accomplishment and acclaim.
Yeah. This is something I'm still wrestling with as I write, and I'm going back, and you know, in one sense, there's no question that both these men, you know, had high opinions of themselves, and Chase maybe even more so than Seward. But you know, I think that historians have overplayed the ambition angle of Chase, and in particular, when you look at kind of the 20 years leading up to the Civil War, you know, his decision in 1841 to kind of leave a promising career as a Whig politician and join the Liberty Party. I mean, the Liberty Party at that time was smaller than the Green Party today. So would you call a promising young Democratic politician, let's say, you know, Mayor Pete from Indiana, if he were to renounce the Democratic Party and say, no, I'm a Green Party candidate now, would you say that he was ambitious, or would you say he was crazy? I think one can overdo the Chase was ambitious angle. I think the main reason it persists is that in 1864, Chase was a candidate for president in rival with President Lincoln. And we so honor and revere President Lincoln that we find that sort of almost an unforgivable sin. But at the time, it was not unusual for cabinet members to kind of be, when I say at the time, I'm not talking about just 1864, but the 19th century generally. You know, presidential candidates generally or often were members of the cabinet.
Well, let's stick with Lincoln then, Walter. I wonder if you could talk a bit about, I know what you've written about what Chase thought of Seward leading up to the convention in Chicago, but what were his impressions of candidate Lincoln. And then once Lincoln does win the nomination and then the White House, we know a bit about his approach to trying to bring Seward in, with Seward at first rejecting it and then being brought aboard. Was it likewise with Chase? Was Chase willing to serve? And then once he did, what was the relationship like with Chase and Lincoln when they were in the room together? We know Seward has unprecedented access to Lincoln. Did Chase enjoy anything near that share? And the personal dynamic between those two from 1861, say, to 64.
Yeah. So Chase and Lincoln did not know one another as well, anywhere near as well as Chase and Seward knew one another at the sort of outset of the Civil War. Chase had done some work campaigning for Lincoln. One of the things that I spent a lot of time trying to build up, Chase participated in the famous Lincoln-Douglas campaign of 1858, and I thought that was quite interesting, and Lincoln appreciated that. He wrote a very gracious thank you letter to Chase for coming. And then the next year, Lincoln came to Ohio to kind of campaign for Republican candidates there, and Chase appreciated that. I don't, in terms of like the weeks right up to the convention, I don't think that Chase ever thought it would be Lincoln until he got the telegram saying it's Lincoln. I mean, Lincoln was that far off the radar screen. But he was happy because he had been worried that the Republicans were going to opt for someone like Edward Bates. And he had written in one letter that he couldn't abide. He wrote, "I have lost patience with what I hear of hunting of the fossils," and he meant there people like Edward Bates, who was a good 10 or 15 years older. "It will do for paleontologists, but not for Republicans." And Lincoln, was younger, and so definitely not a fossil in Chase's view. So he was quite enthused about the nomination of Lincoln, and he went to work and campaigned for him. Once they get to Washington and they're, in office, he does not have the kind of easy access to Lincoln that Seward does. Partly it's a question of geography. Seward very wisely rents a house right there on Lafayette Square, a short walk from the White House. And that really should have been where Chase lived because, a short walk from the White House, a short walk from the Treasury, but he lived at the corner of 6th and E Streets. So it was a little bit of a hike to get from Chase's house to the White House or vice versa. And I don't have much evidence. Occasionally Lincoln would show up to Chase's house or vice versa, but nowhere near as often as Seward showed up and Lincoln showed up at Seward's house.
Another question from Facebook. Can you discuss Chase within Lincoln's cabinet and how he tried to become the Republican nominee in 1864?
Sure. So, in the cabinet, Chase, he made a point of being there for every cabinet meeting, and he criticized Lincoln both in his diary and in his letters for not holding more cabinet meetings and relying more on the cabinet. I mean, Chase, Lincoln would occasionally, fire the most important general, the head of the Army of the Potomac, and hire a new one without conferring with the cabinet. And that just sent Chase through the roof. He felt that those kind of decisions ought to be at least discussed in the cabinet. I mean, he understood that the president was the president and had the final say, but he felt that Lincoln did not rely upon his cabinet enough. And he disliked Lincoln's failure to do that. Chase, Seward relatively early on gets a note from someone who's formed the Seward Club of Philadelphia to sort of push for Seward in 64. And Seward sends a note back saying, I do not want this. He just did not wish to be a candidate in 1864. Chase felt differently, in part because of blacks. He was, of all the cabinet members, Chase was the one kind of closest to what was going on in the South. And he felt that Lincoln was not moving rapidly enough to enlist blacks in the army and to involve blacks in the process of forming new state governments and to give blacks the right to vote. And so other people who agreed with him on this issue wanted Chase as the candidate in 1864 rather than Lincoln. And Chase was willing to let them kind of run with it. And he, I think it's fair to say, encouraged them because he thought that he thought he could do a better job with the first 4 years after the war than Lincoln. And that fell apart in February of 64 when a document that some of his supporters had drafted arguing that Lincoln was too much of a compromiser was leaked, and the reaction in Ohio was that the Republicans of Ohio in Columbus, the legislators issued a document saying they supported Lincoln, and without his home state, Chase realized he had no chance, so he withdrew his name. So he then continues in the Lincoln cabinet. So it gives you a sense that Lincoln didn't view his candidacy as quite the unpardonable sin that modern readers tend to. Lincoln was, liked the work that Chase was doing in the Treasury and was happy for him to continue that until June of 64 when Chase resigned.
And
sorry, a long answer, but I could actually go on quite a bit longer.
Another question that just came in on Facebook, are there any current politicians who you think parallel Seward and Chase in character and ideas? A tough one.
That's a tough one. I'm not thinking of any off the top of my head. There's a Seward quote that it's in the book, and I think I've posted it a couple of times recently. Right after the 1860 election, a bunch of young Republicans come there to the House. I'm pointing to you all as if you were in the House. I realize you're not in the House. And he talks about how, in elections, we refer to the other party as the enemy. And he says, look, this is just a figure of speech. We are all Americans. We are all brothers. I don't see that magnanimity in a lot of current politicians. I wish I saw more of it.
And another question from Facebook that brings us back to Auburn a little bit more, asking who was Captain Seward mentioned in an 1829 Auburn paper, and they quoted it as being the artillery company of this village under the command of Captain Seward appeared on Saturday last in superior military style.
I think I'm going to say, I don't know. I honestly don't know. I'm also, I'm blanking on when Seward first gets to Auburn. And it could be William Henry Seward because he was in the militia. And in those days, today, people who serve in the National Guard, we serve part-time in the National Guard, we generally don't refer to them by their military titles. We say, Mr. Smith or Ms. Jones. So if you send me the site, I will do a little digging and try to answer that by way of email, Maria, which you can then forward to whoever, or maybe I'll put it on my website, Captain Seward, 1829.
Yes, so we will do some more digging into that question. Another one, Seward related, why do you think John Wilkes Booth targeted Seward?
Right. You know, some folks have kind of done a bunch of work in statutes and sort of said, you know, in the case of the death of both the president and the vice president, the secretary of state under such and such a statutory provision would have to organize the election. But John Wilkes Booth was not a lawyer. He was an actor, and he saw Seward very much as kind of the power behind the throne. And so he was going to do a new version of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, in which he was going to kill, you know, not only Caesar, but also Mark Antony in order to really get rid of the dictators. He saw Seward as, he thought, and I think in a sense he was right, that if Lincoln had died and Seward had not been injured, that Seward would basically have taken over and run things. That, you know, President Andrew Johnson would have been very much guided by Seward in those first few weeks. It didn't happen that way because Seward himself was in bed recovering from all the knife wounds. So, in a sort of sixth sense, maybe Booth was right to target Seward as well as Lincoln and Johnson. More?
I have more, and please keep them coming to us. In the meantime, don't let me get through all of mine. Walter, it occurs to me you've written 2 books now. Well, you'll soon to have written 2 books featuring men who rose to the position of Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. We've had, I think our current Secretary of State's number 70. We've had 45 presidents, but only, if my count's correct again, 17. I think Justice Roberts is number 17. Favorite pastime of public historians is perhaps to rank presidencies, and I know Seward usually ranks really high on these listicles of Secretary of State. But when you think about the legacy of a man like Chase as Chief Justice, I realize his tenure wasn't particularly a long one. Do you tend to rank him a very good one, in the middle of the pack, towards the bottom? And what were some of the characteristics, defining moments of the Chase court?
Oof. Well, he's certainly not, you know, when people talk about the great Chief Justices, you know, he's not going to be mentioned in the same breath with John Marshall or Earl Warren. But I would say that he was a good Chief Justice. In terms of sort of some of the big moments of the Chase court, I mean, I'm dealing with one now that in a sense isn't the Supreme Court, but in those days, justices rode circuit. They still have some nominal, you know, control over circuits, but in those days, they actually went and sat and heard cases. In late 1867, in Baltimore, Chase hears the case of a young girl whose mother, on the sort of the day after slavery ended in Maryland, signed an apprenticeship agreement with the girl's former master, by which she became his apprentice. I'm using air quotes because she was really a slave in all but name. And Chase hears the case and issues an opinion that says, look, this is slavery. It pretends to be an apprenticeship, but she's not being treated the way white apprentices are. And so she is free. And by implication, he freed something like maybe 3,000 other young blacks who were subject to similar apprenticeship agreements in Maryland at the time. So his, and this is sort of consistent with my general theme, that the important decisions of his time relate to blacks and their rights and Reconstruction and the South. And I think he does a pretty good job of pointing the court in the right direction on those issues.
Oh, so Walter, I have in my office, I lent it out, shameless plug, tomorrow, I know our Director of Collections, Emily, was going to spend some time looking at some objects tied to Chase in the house, and we want to do something with that. I lent her my copy of John Niven's Chase biography, which came out in 1995. When you were working on Seward, you were following in the footsteps of biographers before you, like John Taylor or Glyden Van Dusen. I wonder if you could take us into your writer's workshop and what your attitude and approach is with biographers who've come before. Do you try to avoid spending too much time with them when you're writing your own chapters so they don't temper your interpretations and analysis? Do you engage with them in your mind, not on the pages, agreeing, disagreeing? What do you do with the other biographies as you're crafting your own original one?
Yeah. Oof. Well, but my relationship with John Niven is particularly complicated because not only does he have, you know, the kind of the best current biography out there, but he spent, perhaps 15 years of his life kind of gathering up, it's not quite all of Chase's papers, but a lot, and then also publishing 5 volumes of edited correspondence. So this is volume 5, which came out just a few weeks after Niven passed away. And so I'm incredibly grateful. I couldn't possibly do what I do without the work that Niven and his team of graduate students did in gathering all this information and creating a database, and then reading it. Chase's handwriting is terrible, and so whenever possible, I'd rather read someone's transcript, and then if I'm doubtful, then I go try to read the handwriting. But I also frequently, I don't spend a ton of time as I'm writing, reading what he wrote, but when I do, I often sort of shake my head and say, where did you get that? Or, no, I'm sorry, it wasn't that year, it was the next year. And in particular, the period that I'm in now, I feel like he just was sort of, he wasn't that interested in Chase as a lawyer and judge. And so he doesn't talk about some of what I think are the really interesting, important cases of Chase's time as Chief Justice.
Well, I'll ask one more question and maybe somebody else will step up on Facebook to close this out. But my last question to you, Walter, I know our time is running short, is let's make it easy again. Book recommendations. What good history books are you reading right now in your spare time? What's on your bookshelf, fiction, nonfiction, and what would you recommend to everybody at home looking for the next good book for the summer?
Oh, gosh. I read a lot of stuff that's related to this period, but I think of that as more the work side. Although I did, the biography of Frederick Douglass, who's not far from you all there in Auburn, up in Rochester, it deserved all the attention it got. And if folks haven't read that yet, right now I'm back in the Napoleonic Wars with Horatio Hornblower on the deck of his ship. I've read those books a couple of times, and I'm rereading one of them. It's a little escapist, but this is, for me at least, is a time when a little escapism is allowed.
We do have a final question that just came in on Facebook. Has your research ever led you across Benjamin Robbins Curtis, who resigned from the US Supreme Court over the Dred Scott decision from which he dissented, and later joined the team of lawyers defending Andrew Johnson in his impeachment trial? Obviously a man of great commitment to his ideals.
Yes, I mean, how to put it? I don't know a lot about him. You know, in a way, he would be an important figure in my current book if he had stayed on the Supreme Court and then been, you know, one of Chase's colleagues. But he is going to get a mention when I talk about Dred Scott in the Chase book, and he's probably going to get a mention again when he shows up as one of the lawyers in the impeachment trial in front of. I mean, coming back to Jeff's question about reading recommendations, there is a really good book. It's now about 10 years old on the impeachment called Impeached. About the Johnson impeachment, and if folks are, you know, curious to learn more about how and why Johnson was impeached, that's a good place to start. I'm going to wind up covering it kind of 3 times from 3 perspectives in Seward, Stanton, and Chase, but I can't go into all the fascinating details about you know, the lawyer's decisions, and the author of that, my friend David Stewart, is a lawyer who actually has some experience with impeachments, and so he's very good on the decisions that the lawyers make.
Well, it looks like we are just about nearing the end of our time. Thank you so much, Walter, for joining us. Thank you to everybody who's watching us live on Facebook and for all of your great questions during today's discussion. Please visit Walter's website, walterstahr.com, look at his blog to find out more about his upcoming projects. And we hope that once things return to some sense of normalcy, we're able to welcome you back to Auburn and get you a little later time zone for our next discussion on your new book. But thank you so much for joining us today, Walter.
Yes, no, I hope to be back in person in Auburn. You know, I did events when the Seward book first came out. I did an event when the Stanton book came out, and I very much hope to be there with you all in person in late 2021 or early 2022 to talk about Seward and Chase.
Well, again, everybody who's watching live or may watch this later on, thank you for tuning in as always and for supporting the museum, and we will see you again soon.